There were two phases to how Mirelle's workroom operated. The first between 1938, when it opened, to around 1950, and the second from around 1950 to 1978, when Mirelle closed, with a period of transition in the 50s. In the first workroom video, we talked about what Hull was like for people wanting their clothes made for them in 1938 when it opened. Dressmakers all over the city offering their services to women in a process called made to measure or bespoke. We're going to look at that first stage again, what the workroom did in the design arm, and learn about some key terms all dressmakers understand and use even today. The job advert that was mentioned in the first workroom video that Mirror placed in the summer of 1938, the one for the mannequin and workroom apprentice, was quickly followed up by her advertising for other workroom staff. From October 1938 throughout the remaining years at the House of Mirelle, she built a workroom which in 1946, at its peak, had 12 full-time seamstresses and tailoresses, you see here. A tailoress is the feminized word for a tailor, and the way the workroom girls described that role. From 1947 and overlapping with most of these women, they also had a designer, Christine Edwards, who you see in the 60 King Edward Street window in the showroom video number 4. They needed these 12 workroom hands, as the generic job titles were known in the industry, and they were necessary as clothes were still being made then at the House of Mirelle. We'll go into a bit more depth about the jobs advertised for Mirelle's workroom in a later video, so don't forget to subscribe to be told when that one is live. When Betty Sykes and the apprentice joined Mirelle Gowns in 1938, the process of making an outfit was exactly the opposite of off the peg, which we talk about in the locations of the chain store C and A. Mirror's high-class dressmaking business, a phrase she included in a sale advert from 1940, had to compete at the top end with Madame Clapham in Hull, and at the other end draw people away from purchasing Dorville or Susan Small or Jaeger or Aquascutum or other ready-to-wear labels in favour of having their clothes specially made for them, their mothers or their daughters. The making process we talked about in the first workroom video was intensive and expensive. The dressmaker responsible for all parts of it, from handling the ideas the clients had to realising this in a design, then taking that to the seamstresses staffing the workroom to make into pattern blocks that we talk about in the first workroom video. They'd then do the drafting and redrafting necessary once that design was decided on, making the pattern block into a paper pattern and then a toile, which we'll explain a bit later on. The toile is a French word spelt Toile. There at the beginning, Betty's time at Mirelle was not only one where she made lots of outfits, which we'll look at in the weddings video coming up, but also one of training and consolidating skills. Betty's daughter recalls her sewing practices later in life, years after she left the House of Mirelle, talking about how she made clothes for her, starting with a comment about commercial paper patterns, then continuing to mention the process of making a toile, saying McCall's, Butterick, etc. Occasionally she would use one, but I remember her always struggling with them. I do remember how a garment was made from plain, cheap, would it be rayon or lining material, and pinned onto you before making it out of the expensive material. What Betty's daughter describes is echoed in the memories of how clothes were made by Betsey Curtis, who joined the workroom at Elsie Battle in 1947, and we talk about in the first workroom video. Betsey was roughly a contemporary of Betty's and followed the same way of making, but how patterns were drafted was mentioned much later on in the lifetime of Mirelle, when Christine, a workroom girl who's not Christine Edwards, started in 1963, having completed a formal apprenticeship at a place called Anne Eiler's in Hull and the Art College side by side. Liz and Janet, who started in the workroom as apprentices and trained by Christine in 1968, said using commercial paper patterns wasn't how they did it either, although at this point they were only using their private time at Mirelle to make their own clothes. This sort of detail defines the type of work taught to them and used in their design arm to create clothing, as well as the skills they had too. Molly Kidd was a dressmaker by background and was Mirelle's manager. You met her in the showroom video number 1, and she would also have known how to construct and deconstruct clothes. She was very much a bridge between the showroom and the workroom, ripping clothes along seams so loudly the sound of fabric being cut and torn could be heard all the way in La Boutique when they were in Carmichael's. Alterations were the only work carried out then, and Molly's activities were overseen by Mildred, the head of the workroom, sent straight to their workroom to finish up. From the point of view of making in the present day, amateur dressmakers buy commercial paper patterns from companies like McCall's or Butterick, who are still trading, then use the pattern pieces to make up their clothes based on the design illustrated or photographed on the cover. If any of you make clothes at home, you'll have a collection of patterns you've used. As Betty's daughter said, this was not how the workroom operated. Like couturiers, they'd know how to draft a pattern block based on a customer's measurements, then use cheap fabric to make up a prototype like a practice run into what Betty's daughter describes, and that's a toile. The other way of making patterns was to use cheap fabric on a client's body to work out where their lumps and bumps were. And once that was pinned and darts were put in, they would take that to the workroom table and use that to make a paper pattern. From that, they could then make a toile. Toiles were also used in couturiers' workrooms. They were mock-ups of outfits that would be adjusted to iron out any issues with the design and check the fit on a clothes form called a tailor's dummy, dress form, or mannequin, which you have to be careful about using because in the late 30s and 40s, fashion models were also called mannequins. Fitting was a specific term in the context of the workroom, meaning making adjustments to an outfit and part of the making process, whether using a toile or using the final cloth. The workroom girl would look carefully at the way it hung on the body of the owner, taking up shoulder seams if it was hanging badly, or removing sleeves and repositioning them to make them sit better on the wearer, as well as many other minute or large revisions to an outfit like a dress in order to be certain that the fit was correct before it was finalised. In the context of what Betty described as the process Mirelle's dressmaker would go through while she was there in 1938 to 1941, she returned in 1944 and then left in 1945, by the way. She'd make a toile of the original illustrated design created by the workroom. It's not known if they had a specific designer there then. Betty said she designed the dresses they produced, as well as the dressmaker. Then and only then would the workroom cut out the fabric, which could often be extremely expensive, like you'd find in a wedding dress, which we'll cover in the weddings videos, so don't forget to subscribe to find out when they're uploaded. As you can see, going to the design arm took time. Time was something wealthier women had in abundance, and travelling to 6 Albion Street or Studio 5 of the Church Institute or 60 King Edward Street or the salon at Ariel Chambers was a necessary set of appointments in their diaries to be fitted for each item they'd commissioned the dressmaker to make, something that would be impossible if they had to travel the 140 miles plus to go to a more famous dressmaker in London's Mayfair. Each stage was a step in the process of making a gown. After Betty left, Christine Edwards' designs that survive from 1947 to 1948, an example of one you see here, shows the creative and imaginative stage, where a designer talked to a client, realised the ideas they had in a paper-based sketch. In her House of Mirelle, directly after the war, until the beginning of 1952 when she left, her design was then handed to the workroom staff to realise, and Eileen Goodlass, who was one of the workroom girls pictured in 1946, says she would have been based in the workroom with them. Betty made toiles between 1938 and 1939, and Christine Edwards' designs signifies the extent to which the workroom followed the steps that couturiers did too. For any of you thinking that you'd like to see toiles in action, Google Christian Dior, designer of dreams, and add the word toile, that's Toile, afterwards. You'll see an exhibition room full of toiles that his design team created before cutting out the cloth to make the pieces, some of which are so famous today. In Dior's workroom when it was established, and part of his atelier in the late 1946 era before his first public collection in February 1947, a team of seamstresses realised the designs he created and drew some of the most famous in fashion history. And in the Mirelle workroom, the process was pretty much the same. If you look at video 1 about fashion illustration, you'll see an imagined process for designing a black strapless dress, which is part of the Mirelle clothing collection, which you'll see analysed in a video coming up, so don't forget to subscribe. Then they'd make one-off items designed with one woman in mind, and they'd follow the same steps. Design an idea like the one illustrated, agree it with the person commissioning it, measure the woman, create a pattern block, cut out a toile, fitting it to her, cutting out the cloth and fitting those cut out pieces on her body before finishing the piece for her to pay for and wear. Doesn't it sound elaborate in comparison with Off the Peg? But then it was simply what upper-class women did, said Betty. But now we'd call it couture, a word used quite appropriately to describe not only the process of what women did in the Mirelle workroom, but also what many wholesale couture houses in Britain of the 50s and 60s did to produce clothes. We'll cover more about wholesale couture in the fashions video, and there's a little bit about it in the fashion history sections in the locations as well. Do you think you'd have time to go through the process of having an item made for you like they did at the House of Mirelle before 1950? What can you see are the pitfalls of buying clothes this way from a modern point of view? Let us know in the comments below.